In the hushed corridors of Windsor Castle, where centuries of secrets echo through ancient stone, one woman dared to break the royal silence. Sophie, Countess of Wessex, had always been known as the quiet member of the royal family, the one who stayed in the shadows while others commanded headlines. But on a crisp autumn morning in 2021, she would step forward to share something no one expected: the raw, unfiltered truth about how the Queen was really coping after losing her beloved Philip. What Sophie revealed that day would shock the world and forever change how we understand the woman behind the crown. This isn't just another royal story. This is the moment when duty met devastation, when a grieving widow had to choose between her broken heart and her unwavering service to a nation. Sophie's words would lift the veil on the most private moments of Britain's longest reigning monarch, revealing a side of Queen Elizabeth II that the public had never seen before. The truth was more heartbreaking and more inspiring than anyone could have imagined. The morning of April 9th, 2021, began like any other at Windsor Castle. The Queen had risen early, as was her custom for over 7 decades, and was reviewing her red boxes of state papers when the call came. Prince Philip, her husband of 73 years, had peacefully passed away in his sleep. In that single moment, Elizabeth Windsor ceased to exist, leaving only the Queen, a woman whose personal grief would forever be secondary to her public duty. Sophie Rhys-Jones, now the Countess of Wessex, was among the first to arrive at Windsor Castle that morning. Having married Prince Edward in 1999, she had spent over 2 decades observing the intricate dynamics of the royal family. Unlike other members who often found themselves at the center of media storms, Sophie had cultivated a reputation for discretion and genuine warmth. She understood the delicate balance between public service and private emotion that defined royal life. As she walked through the castle's grand corridors that morning, Sophie noticed something that would haunt her for months to come. The Queen, despite having just lost her life partner, was already immersed in the arrangements for Philip's funeral. There were no tears visible, no dramatic displays of grief, just the steady, methodical approach to duty that had defined her reign. But Sophie, with her keen eye for human emotion, could see what others might miss: the slight tremor in the Queen's hands as she signed documents, the way her gaze lingered just a moment too long on empty chairs, the barely perceptible pause before she spoke Philip's name. The days following Philip's death revealed a side of the royal family that the public rarely witnessed. While the world saw carefully orchestrated statements and formal funeral arrangements, Sophie observed the quiet moments that spoke volumes about the Queen's true state of mind. She watched as the monarch would unconsciously set 2 places at tea, only to remember moments later that she was now dining alone. She noticed how the Queen's daily walks through the castle grounds became longer and more solitary, as if she were searching for something or someone who would never again be there. During one particularly poignant evening, Sophie found herself in the Queen's private sitting room, where Philip's reading glasses still lay on his favorite table, untouched since his last day. The Queen sat in her usual chair, but kept glancing toward Philip's empty seat with an expression of such profound loneliness that Sophie felt compelled to speak. It was in these private moments that the true extent of the Queen's grief became apparent, not through dramatic outbursts or public displays, but through the small, heartbreaking habits of a woman learning to live alone after 7 decades of partnership. The preparation for Philip's funeral became both a blessing and a burden for the Queen. The endless details and protocols provided structure to her days, giving her mind something to focus on beyond her loss. Sophie watched as the Queen threw herself into every aspect of the planning, from selecting the music to approving the guest list, truncated by COVID restrictions. Each decision seemed to serve as both a tribute to Philip and a shield against her own pain. But it was during the quiet hours after the official business had concluded that Sophie witnessed the Queen's most vulnerable moments. Late one evening, while walking past the Queen's study, Sophie heard the soft sound of classical music, Philip's favorite Beethoven symphony, playing quietly in the darkened room. Through the partially open door, she could see the Queen sitting perfectly still, her eyes closed, as if trying to hold onto the memory of countless evenings when that same music had filled their shared space. The weight of royal protocol during such a personal tragedy struck Sophie as particularly cruel. While any ordinary widow might have had weeks or months to grieve privately, the Queen was immediately thrust into the public eye. There were statements to approve, funeral arrangements to oversee, and the constant awareness that every expression, every gesture would be scrutinized by millions around the world. Sophie began to understand that for the Queen, grief was not a luxury she could afford. It was something to be managed, controlled, and carefully rationed between her public duties. One afternoon, while helping to sort through condolence letters from world leaders, Sophie observed the Queen reading a particularly touching message from a young girl who had also lost her grandfather. For just a moment, the royal mask slipped, and Sophie saw tears gathering in the Queen's eyes. But even as the emotion threatened to overwhelm her, the Queen composed herself, dictated a thoughtful response, and continued with the next letter. It was this extraordinary display of self-control that would later compel Sophie to speak out about what she had witnessed. The funeral itself presented perhaps the most heart-wrenching image of the Queen's isolation. Due to COVID restrictions, she sat alone in St. George's Chapel, a small figure in black against the vast Gothic architecture. While the world saw a monarch fulfilling her duty with dignity, Sophie knew the deeper truth. This was a woman saying goodbye to her best friend, her confidant, and her partner in the most public and lonely circumstances imaginable. In the days immediately following the funeral, Sophie noticed a change in the Queen that was both inspiring and deeply concerning. There was a new determination in her movements, a renewed focus on her duties that seemed almost aggressive in its intensity. It was as if the Queen had made a conscious decision to channel her grief into her service, using work as both medicine and distraction. But Sophie also saw the cost of this approach. The way exhaustion would creep into the Queen's features by evening, the moments when she would seem to forget where she was or what she was doing, as if her mind had briefly wandered to a place where Philip still existed. The royal household staff, many of whom had served the Queen for decades, began to worry about her well-being. They noticed changes in her routine, meals eaten hastily or skipped entirely, a reluctance to leave Windsor Castle for other residences, and an almost obsessive attention to correspondence that mentioned Philip. Sophie found herself in a unique position of being close enough to observe these changes while maintaining enough distance to see them objectively. It was during this period of observation and growing concern that Sophie began to formulate the thoughts that would later lead to her unprecedented public comments about the Queen's state of mind. She recognized that the world's perception of the Queen's grief, or apparent lack thereof, was fundamentally misunderstood. The public saw strength and stoicism, but Sophie saw something far more complex. A woman who had learned to grieve while performing, to mourn while maintaining the facade of unshakable stability that her position demanded. The turning point came during a private family gathering in late April, when Sophie witnessed the Queen laugh for the first time since Philip's death. It was a brief moment, sparked by a story Prince Edward shared about their father's legendary sense of humor. But as quickly as the laughter came, it vanished, replaced by what Sophie recognized as guilt. Guilt for experiencing even a moment of joy in the midst of such profound loss. This glimpse into the Queen's emotional struggle convinced Sophie that the public needed to understand the true nature of royal grief and the extraordinary strength it required to bear such loss while serving a nation. The weeks following Prince Philip's funeral brought a new rhythm to Windsor Castle, one that Sophie found both fascinating and heartbreaking to observe. The Queen had always been a creature of habit, but now these habits took on a deeper significance. They became her anchors in a world that suddenly felt unmoored. Sophie watched as the monarch created new routines around the absence of her husband, each one a small act of survival disguised as royal duty. Every morning at precisely 8 o'clock, the Queen would walk to what had been Philip's study. Sophie learned from the household staff that she would spend exactly 15 minutes there, reading through his personal papers and correspondence. No one knew what she did during these quarter hours, but the staff had been given strict instructions that she was not to be disturbed. Sophie understood that these moments represented something sacred, a daily communion with Philip's memory that gave the Queen strength for the day ahead. The Queen's relationship with food became another source of quiet concern. Philip had always been the one to encourage her to eat regularly, often making lighthearted comments about her tendency to get so absorbed in her work that she would forget meals entirely. Without his gentle reminders, Sophie noticed that the Queen's eating habits became increasingly erratic. Palace chefs confided in Sophie that meals were often returned barely touched, and the Queen's already petite frame began to appear even more fragile. During one particularly telling incident, Sophie arrived for tea to find the Queen staring at a plate of Philip's favorite biscuits that had been prepared out of habit by the kitchen staff. The monarch sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, unable to touch the refreshments that would have normally been shared between them. When Sophie gently suggested they might try different biscuits, the Queen's response was barely audible. "He always said I had terrible taste in biscuits. Perhaps I should try to develop better taste now." The comment, delivered with the Queen's characteristic dry humor, barely concealed the profound sadness underneath. Sophie also began to notice changes in how the Queen interacted with her beloved corgis. Philip had often teased her about her devotion to the dogs, but he had also been genuinely fond of them. Without his presence, the Queen's relationship with her pets took on an almost desperate quality. She would spend hours walking them around the castle grounds, having one-sided conversations that Sophie occasionally overheard. The dogs seemed to sense their mistress's distress, often staying closer to her than usual, and displaying an unusual protectiveness that hadn't been evident before. The evening routine at Windsor Castle became particularly poignant during this period. For decades, the Queen and Philip had shared a private dinner together whenever possible, followed by television programs or light reading. Sophie learned that the Queen now dined alone, but continued to watch Philip's favorite shows, including his beloved cricket matches and nature documentaries. The staff reported that she would occasionally comment aloud during programs, as if Philip were still there to respond to her observations. One evening, while delivering some papers to the Queen's private quarters, Sophie encountered a scene that would remain etched in her memory forever. The Queen sat in her favorite armchair, surrounded by photo albums documenting her life with Philip. The images spanned decades: their wedding day, family holidays, state visits, quiet moments at Balmoral. What struck Sophie most was not that the Queen was looking at these memories, but the methodical way she was organizing them, as if creating a careful archive of their shared history. When she noticed Sophie's presence, the Queen simply said, "I want to make sure the stories are preserved correctly." He had such a wonderful memory for details. The Queen's work schedule, rather than decreasing after Philip's death, seemed to intensify. Sophie observed that the monarch was taking on additional engagements and spending longer hours reviewing state papers. When Edward expressed concern about his mother's increased workload, Sophie realized that the Queen was using duty as a form of therapy. The endless demands of her role provided structure and purpose at a time when her personal world had been devastated. Yet Sophie also recognized the danger in this approach. The Queen was running the risk of burning out at a time when she needed rest and recovery most. The physical toll of grief became increasingly apparent to those close to the Queen. Sophie noticed that she moved more slowly than before, often pausing at the top of staircases as if gathering energy for the climb. The Queen's legendary stamina seemed diminished, and there were moments when she would sit quietly, staring into the distance with an expression of profound weariness. These glimpses of vulnerability made Sophie realize that behind the public facade of strength, the Queen was struggling with the simple act of continuing to exist without her life partner. Communication with family members revealed another dimension of the Queen's grief. Sophie observed that the monarch had become even more protective of family privacy than usual, if such a thing were possible. Conversations about Philip were kept brief and factual, emotions carefully contained within the bounds of royal protocol. But Sophie noticed that the Queen's eyes would soften whenever grandchildren visited, as if their presence reminded her of the life she and Philip had built together. The Queen's spiritual life also underwent changes during this period. Always a woman of faith, she began attending private chapel services more frequently, often requesting readings from passages that Philip had particularly enjoyed. Sophie learned from the chaplain that the Queen had asked for prayers focused on gratitude rather than grief, a request that perfectly exemplified her approach to loss. Even in her darkest moments, she was determined to frame her sorrow in terms of thankfulness for what she had experienced rather than bitterness about what she had lost. Sleep became another challenge for the grieving monarch. Staff members reported that lights in the Queen's quarters would often remain on late into the night, and she would sometimes be found in the library at unusual hours, reading or simply sitting quietly. Sophie understood that the long nights were probably the most difficult times, when the public duties ended and the Queen was left alone with her memories and her loss. The Queen's correspondence took on new significance during this period. She began personally responding to more sympathy letters than protocol required, particularly those from people who had also lost spouses after long marriages. Sophie noticed that these responses were longer and more personal than usual, as if the Queen found comfort in connecting with others who understood the unique pain of losing a life partner. The monarch seemed to draw strength from offering comfort to others, even as she struggled with her own grief. Perhaps most remarkably, Sophie observed that the Queen never complained. Despite the obvious pain she was experiencing, despite the loneliness that hung around her like a heavy cloak, she never voiced any self-pity or anger about her situation. This stoicism was both inspiring and deeply troubling to Sophie, who recognized that such rigid emotional control came at a tremendous personal cost. The Queen's relationship with objects that reminded her of Philip became another source of both comfort and pain. His reading glasses remained on his bedside table, his walking sticks stood unused by the door, and his favorite chair in the drawing room was left exactly as he had positioned it. Sophie realized that these items served as both shrines to his memory and daily reminders of his absence, a complicated emotional landscape that the Queen navigated with typical grace and private suffering. As May progressed, Sophie began to see signs that the Queen was finding ways to honor Philip's memory that brought her genuine comfort. She commissioned a special garden at Windsor Castle featuring his favorite flowers and arranged for the restoration of a vintage Land Rover that he had particularly enjoyed driving. These projects seemed to energize the Queen in ways that her official duties could not, suggesting that she was beginning to find healthy ways to channel her grief into positive action. The world continued to watch the Queen with admiration and concern, but Sophie knew they were seeing only the surface of a much deeper story. The monarch's ability to function at such a high level while dealing with profound personal loss was nothing short of extraordinary, but it came at a price that few people could fully understand. It was this recognition that would eventually compel Sophie to share her observations with the world, believing that people deserve to understand the true nature of the Queen's strength and the real cost of royal duty. By late May 2021, Sophie had witnessed something that few people in the world would ever see: a monarch learning to grieve while maintaining the facade of invincibility that her position demanded. The strain was beginning to show in ways that alarmed those closest to the Queen, though the general public remained unaware of the depth of her struggle. It was during this period that Sophie made a decision that would surprise the royal family and shock the world. She would break the traditional code of silence surrounding royal private life. The catalyst came during what should have been a routine family gathering at Windsor Castle. Sophie arrived to find the Queen in her private sitting room, staring at a half-completed jigsaw puzzle that she and Philip had been working on together. The image was of Balmoral Castle, their beloved Scottish retreat, where they had spent their happiest private moments. Philip's reading glasses lay beside the puzzle, and it was clear that the Queen had been trying to finish it alone. When Sophie gently asked about the puzzle, the queen's composure finally cracked. For the first time since Philip's death, Sophie saw tears streaming down the monarch's face. "I can't remember which pieces he placed," the queen whispered, her voice breaking. "I don't want to disturb his work, but I can't seem to find where mine should go either." In that moment, Sophie realized that the queen's grief had reached a critical point. She was becoming paralyzed by the desire to preserve Philip's memory while simultaneously needing to continue living her own life. The conversation that followed would change everything. For nearly an hour, the queen spoke openly about her loneliness, her fears about the future, and her struggle to find meaning in a life that had been shared for so long. She confessed to Sophie that she sometimes forgot Philip was gone, reaching for the phone to call him or saving up stories to tell him later. Most heartbreakingly, she admitted that she felt guilty for every moment of peace or joy she experienced, as if happiness were somehow a betrayal of his memory. Sophie listened with growing alarm as the queen described sleepless nights spent walking through rooms they had shared, touching objects he had used, trying to feel his presence. The monarch admitted that she had been avoiding certain parts of the castle entirely because the memories there were too painful. She had stopped wearing some of her favorite jewelry because Philip had chosen many of the pieces, and seeing them in the mirror reminded her too sharply of his absence. What troubled Sophie most was the queen's revelation about her public duties. While the world saw a monarch who had thrown herself into her work with renewed vigor, the truth was far more concerning. The queen confessed that she sometimes found herself unable to concentrate during important meetings, her mind wandering to memories of Philip or wondering what he would have thought about various decisions. She described feeling like she was performing a role rather than living her life, going through the motions of being queen while feeling increasingly disconnected from her own identity. The physical toll was becoming undeniable. The queen admitted to Sophie that she had been experiencing dizzy spells and had lost more weight than anyone realized. She described feeling weak and unsteady at times, though she had refused to see doctors for anything beyond her routine checkups. Most alarmingly, she confessed that there were moments when she wondered if it wouldn't be easier to simply give up, to abdicate, and retreat from public life entirely. Sophie realized that she was witnessing a crisis that went far beyond normal grief. The queen was questioning everything that had defined her existence for nearly 7 decades. The loss of Philip had shaken her sense of purpose and identity in ways that threatened not just her personal well-being, but potentially the stability of the monarchy itself. The woman who had been the epitome of strength and duty for generations was struggling with feelings of helplessness and despair. Over the following weeks, Sophie found herself in an unprecedented position. She became the queen's unofficial confidant, the one person to whom the monarch could reveal her deepest fears and vulnerabilities. The queen began calling Sophie during her darkest moments, sometimes in the middle of the night when sleep eluded her. These conversations revealed a woman grappling with profound existential questions about duty, love, loss, and the meaning of a life lived entirely in service to others. During one particularly difficult evening in early June, the queen asked Sophie a question that would haunt them both. What is a queen without her king? Philip gave me strength, perspective, humor, everything that made this role bearable. How do I serve others when I can barely serve myself? The vulnerability in a monarch's voice was heartbreaking, and Sophie realized that the queen was facing a crisis of identity that few people could comprehend. The turning point came when Sophie witnessed the queen attempting to fulfill a particularly demanding public engagement while clearly struggling with exhaustion and grief. Watching the monarch force herself to smile and engage with crowds while internally falling apart, Sophie made a decision that would change both of their lives. She approached the queen with a proposal that initially shocked the monarch. Sophie wanted permission to speak publicly about what she had witnessed, not to sensationalize the queen's pain, but to help the world understand the extraordinary strength required to grieve while serving a nation. The Queen's initial reaction was predictably negative. Royal protocol had always demanded complete privacy regarding personal matters, and the idea of sharing intimate details about her grief seemed almost incomprehensible. But Sophie persisted, arguing that the public's understanding of the Queen's humanity would ultimately strengthen rather than weaken the monarchy. She pointed out that people were already speculating about the Queen's well-being, and that controlled, honest communication would be preferable to wild rumors and misinformation. The debate between them continued for days. Sophie argued passionately that the Queen's struggle was not a sign of weakness, but rather proof of incredible strength. She believed that sharing the truth about royal grief would help people understand that the monarch was not an emotionless figurehead, but a woman capable of deep love and profound loss. The Queen, trained by decades of protocol to keep private matters private, struggled with the concept of such unprecedented openness. What finally convinced the Queen was Sophie's observation about the letters of support she had been receiving. Thousands of people had written to share their own experiences of losing longtime partners, and many had mentioned how much they admired the Queen's strength in continuing her duties despite her grief. Sophie pointed out that these people were connecting with the Queen's humanity, not her perfection, and that honest communication about her struggle might provide comfort to others facing similar losses. The Queen also began to recognize that her current approach to grief was unsustainable. The pretense that she was unaffected by Philip's death was taking an enormous toll on her physical and mental health. Sophie suggested that acknowledging her struggle publicly might actually free her to grieve more authentically, removing some of the pressure to maintain an impossible facade of indifference to loss. After much deliberation, the Queen gave Sophie permission to speak carefully about what she had witnessed, with strict guidelines about what could and could not be shared. The monarch insisted that any public comments must emphasize her commitment to duty and her gratitude for public support, while acknowledging the reality of her grief without dwelling on its most painful aspects. Sophie spent weeks preparing for what she knew would be one of the most scrutinized interviews of her life. She understood that she was breaking new ground in royal communication, sharing insights into the monarch's private life that had never been revealed before. The weight of responsibility was enormous. She needed to honor the Queen's trust while helping the public understand the true cost of royal duty. The decision to speak out was not made lightly by either woman. Both understood that it represented a fundamental shift in how the royal family communicated with the public, moving from complete privacy toward a more open acknowledgement of their humanity. For the Queen, it was perhaps the most difficult decision she had made since Philip's death, choosing to show vulnerability in service of a greater truth about love, loss, and the strength required to continue serving others in the midst of personal devastation. The morning of June 15, 2021, marked a watershed moment in royal history. Sophie, Countess of Wessex, sat across from veteran BBC journalist Emily Maitlis in a carefully arranged room at Bagshot Park, her Surrey home. The interview had been planned in secret for weeks, with only a handful of trusted advisors aware of what was about to unfold. For the first time in modern royal history, a senior member of the family was about to lift the veil on the private grief of the sovereign. Sophie had spent sleepless nights preparing for this moment, reviewing her notes and consulting with the Queen about every potential question. The monarch had given her specific guidance about what could be shared and what must remain private, but she had also granted Sophie unprecedented freedom to speak honestly about what she had witnessed. The weight of this responsibility was evident in Sophie's demeanor as the cameras began rolling. She understood that her words would be analyzed and debated around the world. When Maitlis asked her first question about how the Queen was coping, Sophie paused for a long moment before responding. Her answer would become one of the most quoted statements in royal history. People see the crown and assume it provides armor against human emotion. The truth is quite the opposite. The Queen grieves like any woman who has lost her life partner, but she must do so while carrying the weight of a nation's expectations. What I have witnessed is not the absence of emotion, but the most extraordinary display of strength under unimaginable pressure. Sophie's description of the Queen's daily routine revealed details that shocked viewers worldwide. She spoke about the monarch's morning visits to Philip's study, the untouched personal items that remained exactly as he had left them, and the way the Queen would unconsciously set two places for tea before remembering she was alone. These intimate details painted a picture of grief that was both deeply personal and universally recognizable, helping millions of viewers understand that even queens experience the disorienting pain of loss. The most powerful moment of the interview came when Sophie described finding the Queen with the jigsaw puzzle. Fighting back her own tears, Sophie recounted the monarch's words about not wanting to disturb Philip's pieces while being unable to find where her own should go. The metaphor was so perfect and heartbreaking that viewers around the world immediately understood it as a description of grief itself. The struggle to honor what was shared while finding a way to continue living independently. Sophie's revelation about the Queen's physical decline sent shockwaves through the Commonwealth. She carefully described the monarch's weight loss, the dizzy spells, and the way grief had manifested in exhaustion and disorientation. What made these revelations acceptable to the royal household was Sophie's emphasis on the Queen's determination to continue serving despite these challenges. She presented the monarch's struggle not as weakness, but as evidence of incredible dedication to duty. The interview took an emotional turn when Sophie discussed the Queen's loneliness. She described late-night phone calls from the monarch, conversations about Philip's empty chair at dinner, and the way the Queen had begun talking to her corgis with an intensity that suggested she was desperate for any form of companionship. Sophie's careful words painted a picture of isolation that was particularly poignant given the Queen's constant public presence. Here was a woman surrounded by people, yet fundamentally alone in her grief. Sophie's most controversial revelation concerned the Queen's moments of doubt about her role. She described conversations where the monarch had questioned her ability to continue serving effectively while dealing with such profound loss. Sophie emphasized that these doubts were temporary and that the Queen had never seriously considered abdication, but the mere acknowledgement that such thoughts had crossed the sovereign's mind was unprecedented in royal communication. The public reaction to Sophie's honesty was immediate and overwhelming. Social media exploded with messages of support for the Queen, with millions of people sharing their own experiences of grief and praising the monarch's courage in continuing her duties. Mental health advocates celebrated the interview for normalizing grief and showing that even the most powerful people struggle with loss. The hashtag Queen of Hearts began trending worldwide as people expressed their admiration for the Queen's humanity. However, not everyone appreciated Sophie's candor. Some royal traditionalists criticized the interview as an unnecessary breach of privacy, arguing that the monarchy's mystique was essential to its function. Conservative commentators suggested that revealing the Queen's vulnerability might weaken respect for the institution. Palace insiders were reportedly divided about whether Sophie had gone too far in her revelations. The Queen's response to the public reaction was characteristically measured. Through carefully worded statements released by Buckingham Palace, she expressed gratitude for the outpouring of support while reaffirming her commitment to her constitutional duties. The palace emphasized that the Queen had approved Sophie's comments and appreciated the opportunity to help others understand that grief is a natural human response to loss, even for monarchs. Sophie's interview also sparked important conversations about the support systems available to the royal family during times of crisis. Mental health professionals praised her for showing that seeking help and acknowledging vulnerability are signs of strength rather than weakness. The Royal Foundation announced new initiatives focused on grief counseling and support for those who had lost partners, inspired by the Queen's example of continuing to serve others despite personal pain. International reaction to the interview varied significantly. Commonwealth countries largely responded with increased affection and respect for the Queen, with many leaders issuing statements praising her dedication to duty despite personal loss. However, Republican movements in some countries used the revelations to argue that the emotional cost of monarchy was too high for any individual to bear. These debates highlighted the complex relationship between royal humanity and institutional authority. The interview also had a profound impact on public understanding of royal protocol. Sophie's descriptions of how the Queen had to grieve publicly while maintaining composure helped people appreciate the unique challenges faced by constitutional monarchs. Many viewers commented that they had never before considered how difficult it must be to mourn while carrying out official duties, leading to increased empathy for all members of the royal family. Sophie herself became a figure of both admiration and controversy following the interview. Supporters praised her courage in speaking truthfully about difficult subjects, while critics questioned her motives and appropriateness. The Countess handled the attention with characteristic grace, emphasizing that her primary goal had been to help people understand the Queen's extraordinary strength and dedication to service. The long-term implications of Sophie's interview extended far beyond the immediate media reaction. Royal biographers noted that it marked a fundamental shift in how the monarchy communicated with the public, moving from complete opacity about personal matters toward a more transparent acknowledgement of the human costs of royal duty. Future royal communications would be shaped by the precedent Sophie had set, balancing respect for privacy with honest acknowledgement of emotional reality. As the dust settled from the interview's immediate impact, it became clear that Sophie had achieved something remarkable. She had managed to reveal the Queen's humanity without diminishing her authority, to show vulnerability without suggesting weakness, and to honor both personal grief and public duty. The interview would be remembered as a watershed moment when the royal family chose honesty over mystique, helping millions of people around the world better understand both the privileges and the burdens of wearing the crown. In the months following Sophie's groundbreaking interview, the ripple effects of her revelations continued to reshape both the royal family's relationship with the public and the Queen's own journey through grief. What had begun as one woman's courageous decision to speak honestly about royal suffering had evolved into a transformative moment for the monarchy itself, proving that vulnerability could strengthen rather than weaken the institution's connection with the people it served. The Queen's response to the overwhelming public support demonstrated her remarkable ability to adapt even in her 90s. Rather than retreating from the newfound openness that Sophie had initiated, the monarch began incorporating subtle acknowledgments of her humanity into her official communications. Her Christmas message that year would include an unprecedented personal reflection on loss and resilience, showing how Sophie's courage had given the Queen permission to be more authentic in her public role. The transformation was most evident during the Queen's first major public engagement after the interview, a visit to a hospice where she met with families dealing with loss. Previously, such visits had been conducted with formal dignity and emotional distance. Now, witnesses reported seeing the Queen engage with grieving relatives with a depth of understanding and empathy that clearly drew from her own experience. She spent extra time with a widow whose husband had recently died, offering comfort that was both royal and deeply personal. Sophie watched these changes with a mixture of pride and relief. Her decision to speak out had not damaged the Queen's reputation, but had instead humanized it in ways that strengthened the monarch's connection with her subjects. Letters continued to pour into Buckingham Palace from people around the world who felt a new kinship with the Queen, understanding her not just as a symbol, but as a woman who had endured the universal experience of loss. The interview had also sparked important changes within the royal household itself. Mental health support systems were quietly put in place for all family members, recognizing that the unique pressures of royal life required specialized understanding. The Queen herself began meeting regularly with counselors who specialized in grief and loss, a development that would have been unthinkable before Sophie's brave revelations. Sophie's relationship with the Queen deepened significantly during this period. The monarch began relying on her daughter-in-law not just as a confidant, but as an advisor on how to navigate the new landscape of royal communication. The Queen recognized that Sophie had successfully bridged the gap between royal duty and human authenticity, skills that would be crucial for the monarchy's future. The Queen's approach to memorializing Philip also evolved, influenced by the public's newfound understanding of her grief. Instead of purely formal tributes, she began commissioning projects that reflected their personal relationship: a garden at Balmoral featuring flowers from their wedding bouquet, a charitable foundation focused on causes Philip had championed privately, and a series of informal photographs released to mark their wedding anniversary. These gestures showed a monarch comfortable with sharing her love story while maintaining appropriate dignity. As autumn arrived, Sophie noticed significant improvements in the Queen's physical and emotional well-being. The weight she had lost began returning gradually, and the dizzy spells that had worried everyone became less frequent. Most importantly, the Queen began sleeping better, no longer spending entire nights wandering through empty rooms or calling Sophie in distress. The public acknowledgement of her struggle had somehow given her permission to begin healing. The Queen's work schedule, while still demanding, became more sustainable. She began delegating more responsibilities to other family members and allowed herself brief periods of private time without feeling guilty about neglecting her duties. Sophie observed that the monarch had learned to honor her grief without being consumed by it, finding ways to carry Philip's memory forward without being paralyzed by his absence. International perception of the British monarchy underwent a significant shift during this period. Leaders from around the world commented on the Queen's courage in allowing her humanity to be seen, with many noting that it had actually increased their respect for the institution. The idea that strength could coexist with vulnerability became associated with the modern British monarchy in ways that enhanced rather than diminished its global influence. Sophie's own role within the royal family was permanently altered by her decision to speak out. She became the unofficial spokesperson for a more open, emotionally honest approach to royal communication. When other family members faced personal challenges, they began turning to Sophie for advice on how to balance transparency with privacy, publicity with dignity. The media's relationship with the royal family also evolved significantly. Sophie's interview had demonstrated that honest, respectful coverage of royal emotions could be more powerful than sensational speculation. Many journalists began approaching royal stories with greater nuance, understanding that the family's humanity was their greatest strength rather than their greatest weakness. By the first anniversary of Philip's death, the transformation was complete. The Queen's public commemoration of the date was markedly different from the formal, distant approach that might have been expected in earlier eras. Instead, she shared personal memories of Philip's humor and dedication, speaking about missing his presence while celebrating his legacy. The speech was deeply moving precisely because it acknowledged the ongoing reality of grief while affirming the continuity of love and service. Sophie's impact extended beyond the royal family to influence how society discussed grief and loss more broadly. Mental health advocates credited her interview with normalizing conversations about bereavement, particularly among elderly people who had lost longtime partners. Support groups reported increased attendance, and many people said that seeing the Queen's struggle had given them permission to acknowledge their own difficulties with loss. The Queen's relationship with Philip's memory settled into a healthy pattern that honored their past while allowing for future growth. She continued her daily visits to his study, but now spent the time reading his letters and papers with joy rather than desperate sadness. Philip's chair remained in its place, but the Queen no longer avoided sitting near it. Instead, she would sometimes sit beside it while working, as if drawing comfort from the continued presence of their shared space. Sophie's children, Louise and James, also played a role in the Queen's healing process. Their grandmother began spending more time with them, finding in their energy and innocence a reminder that life continues and joy remains possible even after profound loss. The Queen delighted in sharing stories about Philip with them, ensuring that they would carry forward memories of their grandfather's wit and wisdom. As 2022 approached, the Queen's Platinum Jubilee celebrations were being planned with a new understanding of how to honor both institutional tradition and personal authenticity. Sophie worked closely with palace advisors to ensure that the events would celebrate the Queen's remarkable service while acknowledging the personal sacrifices and losses that had shaped her reign. The Jubilee would become a testament to the power of vulnerability combined with unwavering dedication to duty. Sophie's decision to speak honestly about the Queen's grief had ultimately achieved something unprecedented. It had modernized the monarchy without diminishing its dignity, humanized the sovereign without weakening her authority, and shown that the greatest strength often comes from acknowledging our deepest vulnerabilities. The royal family emerged from this period more connected to their subjects, more authentic in their public roles, and more sustainable in their approach to the unique challenges of constitutional monarchy. The legacy of that brave interview would continue to influence royal communication for generations to come. Sophie had proven that honesty, compassion, and courage could transform even the most traditional institutions, showing that the monarchy's future lay not in maintaining impossible facades, but in embracing the full complexity of human experience while continuing to serve with dignity and grace. Years later, historians would mark Sophie's interview as the moment when the British monarchy truly entered the modern era, not by abandoning its traditions, but by recognizing that its greatest power had always come from its ability to represent the best of human nature in all its beautiful, fragile, and resilient complexity.